All right, welcome to episode 9, I think, of American Spirits. Once again, losing track because we're getting pretty deep in the series, which is great. I'm once again joined by my co-host, Ryan Turnipseed. How you doing, Ryan?
I'm doing very good. How are you doing?
Surprisingly well, considering the events of last week, but I'll leave that unstated. And we have Mr. Oberon Quinn joining us again. How are you?
I am well. Good evening. Let's confederate.
Indeed, we are confederating. Today we are talking about the book, The Articles of Confederation, an interpretation of the social constitutional history of the American Revolution, 1774 to 1781, by Professor Merrill Jensen. Now, this book is or was considered the seminal history of the Articles of Confederation period of the United States, the Confederation period, if you will. Now, it's fallen out of favor from my understanding, and this is my understanding by reading Reddit and stuff, so that's not to say it's not a favorable text. In fact, quite the opposite. This is quite a good text, and it was really the go-to seminal work on the period up until fairly recently, but we don't need any modern books, do we? This one was published in 1940, actually, by Merrill Jensen, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin. I'll just read you a little bit about Mr. Jensen, just from the Wikipedia page real quick, so you have an idea of his background. His historical interpretations are generally considered to be of the progressive school of American history, the most famous exponent of which was Charles A. Beard. Jensen was a professor of history at the University of Washington, where he was editor of Pacific Northwest Quarterly and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that's all we need to know. And I'll read you a bit about Beard, so you know sort of who was the leader, you might say, of his intellectual school. Jumping forward to Mr. Beard's World War II section, Beard opposed President Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policy. Consistent with Beard's Quaker roots, he became one of the leading proponents of non-interventionism and sought to avoid American involvement in World War II. He promoted American continentalism as an alternative and argued that the United States had no vital interest at stake in Europe and that a foreign war could lead to domestic dictatorship. He continued to press that position after the end of World War II. I think we've read enough there for our audience to comprehend some elements of interest of these two men. So back to Jensen, his book, The Articles of Confederation. So we're doing the first half of it today, the first 100 pages, which is everything in the revolutionary background to the period before we actually get next week to the writing of the Articles of Confederation itself. So I will quote one thing from the preface here really quick. The preface to the third printing, Jensen writes, quote, "Originally, I labeled these new men radicals. Today, I would use the term popular leaders, for the name was often used at the time, and it avoids, in part at least, the reading of present-day connotations into the use of word of radical to describe 18th century politicians. The name popular leaders was used at the time because such men appealed to the people, or in the name of the people, to support their double-edged attack on British policies and on the colonial aristocracies." End quote. So that's important to keep in mind because in the book, the word radical appears quite often. So we should think of the word popular leader instead of radical in those sections. Anyway, that's my brief introduction to the work. Ryan, do you have anything you'd like to say, an introduction to this excellent book?
Yes, I have two things. One on the historiographical, or the School of Historiography that Jensen is a part of, and Beard, the progressive School of Historiography, and a note about the radicals as well before we jump into it. The Progressive School of Historiography, I am quite partial towards, as are quite a lot of people that aren't complete ideologues for the current order. The progressives in history, in the field of history, are renowned for putting like a basic factual and sort of a mundane economic analysis at the forefront. So whereas a lot of histories before them really emphasized noble virtues and specific ideological and personal motivations and whatnot else, all of which are important things to analyze in history. This is perhaps where Beard, especially, you mentioned him at the beginning, goes wrong, but that's a topic for another time. The progressives really emphasize the economic forces at play and sort of the personal profit incentives at some times, the larger national economy at others. And it provides a much more grounded analysis of history if you read from Jensen or Beard or any of the others, as opposed to, say, like a Carlyle, who is much more ethereal and metaphysical, perhaps even abstract at points. Not a knock against either group. It's just to say that it's probably good for you, the listener, to have a working understanding of both kinds of history, so as not to have a blind spot when understanding your own history. The second thing about the word radical is not just that it's like a leader of the people or something like that, or the popular movement or whatever else. But they were also radical in the sense that they really stood for deeply held convictions. This isn't what makes them radical, of course, because a hardcore royalist would stand for a deeply held conviction. But they're sort of like a weak group between the royalists and the radicals that I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot in the stream. The conservatives, which quite remarkably seem to always find a weak middle ground that didn't really make much sense, would have very obvious bad consequences if it was implemented and whatnot else. So something else to keep in mind with the radicals is that they actually stood for things. They were ready to enforce them. They organized effectively on the basis of these things, economically motivated or not. Jensen would argue economically motivated, and there's a good argument, but for our purposes, it's good to know that they did have these convictions and it did motivate them towards doing things.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, well, I guess it's probably helpful to the audience to begin by setting up our factions here. We've talked about the popular leaders, the radicals, and we've talked about the conservatives. The book itself uses the term conservative, and as Ryan alluded to, it doesn't have today's meaning. It's more in the meaning of preservation of the prior way of doing things, which is always going to be located at a specific point in time. And indeed, we are just entering into the period of history where the terms conservative and radical start to take on an intelligible cast to the modern audience, but it's still important to explain that when we talk about the conservatives, we're talking about the landed and moneyed elites. The colonies up to this point all restricted the franchise to varying degrees and in varying ways. There were property qualifications, there were geographic qualifications, there were religious qualifications that varied from colony to colony, which dictated whether you got the franchise or not. And so coming into the Revolutionary era, you have this entrenched oligarchy of planters and merchants who wield wildly disproportionate political power in their respective colonies. And then set against them, you have the disenfranchised classes, what were often called the mechanics or the mobility. These were tradesmen, these were small farmers, these were laborers, these were all the men who didn't have a political say in the political structures of the colonies as they existed as we are entering the Revolutionary era, but who were clamoring for it and who would seize upon the opportunities afforded by missteps by the British Crown to inflame passions in America to set the stage for an attempt to create something entirely new. And the two, and of course, as against this, the conservatives would obviously look askance at that because being at the top of the pyramid, they did not want to see the pyramid upset. And so as we go through the book, we'll see these developing opposed visions of how America should be governed. The radicals fundamentally wanted to root their vision of governance in what they called natural law. They kind of wanted to reason from first principles towards a new democratic system of government, whereas the conservatives would want to root the American government in the British Constitution. They would hearken back to the statutes of Parliament as they existed at the times of the various colonial charters. This was one of these middle grounds that they would adopt rather than surrendering to Parliament or getting rid of Parliament. They said, well, we'll listen to everything Parliament said up until we got our charter. That's just one example. But these are the two factions whose battle we are about to start going through.
Excellent. This leads very well into a point I wanted to make. Why don't we bring up the screenshot number 7? Before I read from it, I will outline sort of the central thesis of the book. What is this social constitutional interpretation that Jensen is putting forward? His central thesis is basically that the American Revolution should be thought of as an internal revolution against the ruling elite rather than a revolution by Americans, qua Americans against the British. And what he means by that is that the popular leaders and the masses who were excluded from the franchise were dissatisfied with the ordering of things, such that, as we have discussed in these streams many times now, the power and wealth was concentrated among the coastal elites. Those coastal elites happened to draw their power through their colonial charters, through the British Empire. So the revolution to break ties with the British Empire, to the extent it was that and became that, was really a revolution against the American side elites, at least as much as it was a revolution against the British. So this is really important to keep in mind, that the revolution was fundamentally Americans overthrowing the authority of other Americans who may have thought themselves Englishmen, but nevertheless they were all Americans. You know, particularly the Virginians might view themselves as Englishmen with English rights, etc., as we discussed way back at Albion Seed. But it was a revolution within America against the ruling elites. And those elites are many men you might know, many famous founding fathers. So this is not some bad guy faction. It is one part of the American Revolution, and there are many founding fathers who took the other side as well. Anyway, getting to the quote here. So this is page 7, a little bit before what's on screen. It says, quote, "Ordinarily, the revolution is treated as the end of one age and the beginning of another. A new country was born, political parties sprang into being, political leaders full of wisdom learned during the revolution sought to save the new nation from the results of ignorance and inexperience." So runs the story. But the story is only true in an external sense. The basic social forces in colonial life were not eliminated by the Declaration of Independence. There was no break in the underlying conflict between party and party representing fundamental divisions in American society. Those divisions had their roots in the very foundation of the colonies, and by the middle of the 18th century, there had arisen broad social groupings based on economic and political conditions. More and more wealth and political power were concentrated along the coast in the hands of planters in the south and of merchants in the north. There were exceptions, of course, but by and large the colonial governments were in the hands of the economic upper classes. Exceedingly conscious of its local rights, the ruling aristocracy was willing to use democratic arguments to defeat the centralizing policies of Great Britain, but it had no intention of widening the base of political power within the colonies to accord with the conclusions which could be and were drawn from those arguments. On the contrary, it kept itself in power through the use of a number of political weapons. As wealth accumulated and concentrated along the coast, and as the frontier moved westward and became deader and alien in character, and as the propertyless element in the colonial towns grew larger, the owners of property demanded a political interpretation of their favored position, that is, political supremacy as a protection against the economic programs of debtor agrarians and the town poor. Encouraged by the British government, they gradually secured the political safeguards they demanded. End quote. So that more or less ties directly into the contest between the ruling elites and the masses of society in America. This is really the fundamental tension of the American Revolution, more so, Jensen argues, and again, this is his argument, it is an interpretation, more so than it was a revolt against British rule per se. Next, I want to get to the actual part of the book on the internal revolution, starting with Pennsylvania, unless you gentlemen have anything to add to that quote there.
Well, since we're talking about this, the backdrop of this whole thing is that there's a sort of like an internal conflict that is perhaps even more important than the conflict with Britain. The conflict with Britain being itself just a prerequisite for this to even happen in a meaningful sense. This internal split between the current elite and then everyone else. it might be worth clarifying that this is not a usual populist analysis where it's just like us random yokels versus the big, powerful, scary elite elsewhere in the coast. If you recall back to a few of our older episodes, this is, number one, a very middle-class group of people, very, very productive group, and it's also the class that's going further westward, which, if we believe what we talked about during our frontier thesis episode, these are both groups that really form the core of sort of like the American identity after all the necessary prerequisites. The people on the frontier and the middle class are the ones which constitute the radical camp.
Yes,
so I was just going to say that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, and the middle class and the people who don't at this point have political power are not yearning for democracy just for abstract reasons or no reason at all. Each colony had very particular issues that were causing tensions between the people who held political power and the people who didn't. For instance, in Pennsylvania, basically 3 counties in Pennsylvania utterly controlled the assembly, and every new county which was settled was purposely kept enormous and diffuse, precisely so that it could not be represented in the assembly. This also ties into the question of land settlement, and as you guys discussed very much in your excellent stream with Prudentialist on Frederick Jackson Turner, this westward impulse led to this class of people who wanted land, who were then opposed to the class of people, the speculators, who actually owned the land, who had bought it up, and then not for the purpose of settling it, but for the purpose of waiting for the value to go up. And so this great frustration developed because you had all these people, all this surplus population wanting to move west, but being stymied in their ability to do so because these speculators owned all the land and were sitting on it and either charging exorbitant amounts for it or refusing to sell it entirely. This was big in the middle colonies and the southern colonies. Up in New England, where there wasn't so much western land to go get, you had the opposite tension. Since there was no land to expand into, you then had this rat race developing between the landed peoples and the people who didn't have land and who had no outlet. So there are diffuse causes for this rising tension that would develop throughout the 18th century.
Very good. And since you mentioned Pennsylvania there, why don't we go ahead and bring up screenshot 16, which addresses exactly this. Quote, Pennsylvania offers the clearest illustration of some of the basic issues upon which the course of the American Revolution turned. In no other colony were the racial, political, economic lines so sharply drawn, nowhere was the ruling class so opposed to change or to concession, and nowhere was the political revolution so complete in 1776. As the colony had grown in wealth and population, political control had been retained by the 3 old counties of Philadelphia, Bucks, and Chester, and the city of Philadelphia. By the middle of the century, an oligarchy of Quaker merchants and lawyers was dictating most of the policies of government. Their instrument was the colonial assembly, control of which they retained by denying representation to the ever-growing West. Even when new counties were created, they were made so vast in extent and were allotted so few representatives in the assembly that the rule of the East was never endangered. In the East itself, the masses were prevented from threatening oligarchical rule by suffrage laws which excluded all but a small minority of the population. The right to vote was contingent upon the possession of 50 pounds in personal property or a freehold. Neither was easy to secure, at least in the East. In Philadelphia in 1775, only 335 of 3,452 taxable males had estates large enough to give them the vote. End quote. So, yeah, that section's basically what you explained right there. There's something else that I found really interesting as well when in this section on Pennsylvania and the Quakers, which was actually, I found it right here. Quote, the attempt of the Quaker element in the East to convert Pennsylvania from a proprietary into a crown colony was fought bitterly by the Presbyterians in both East and West, end quote. So I found that really interesting because this was a bit of American history I did not know. If you recall from our previous streams, we've discussed this Quaker oligarchy and how effective it was at securing its own control of the destiny of the Pennsylvania colony. right? And we see that clearly illustrated right here, where their control is so tight to the point where there's actually a revolution occurring within Pennsylvania against the Quakers. And it went so far as the Quakers tried to convert their colony into a crown colony. If you remember the different charters the colonies were given, the Quakers were given a special charter that was different from the Virginia charter. And of course, the colonies took their charters very seriously. This was one of the issues that Massachusetts and Virginia had in the Revolution. But in any case, Pennsylvania, apparently their ruling elite actually tried to turn the colony into a crown colony. I suppose that would facilitate a much more strongly backed oligarchy coming directly from the king.
Another illustration of this, a little later in this section, Jensen talks about how the Pennsylvania government actually refused to build roads between Philadelphia and the west of the state, such that the people in the west actually had to build a road to Baltimore instead to get their goods out. And it's an interesting digression into the use of physical infrastructure to shape the political landscape. You see it happening here with the road to Baltimore. You would see it later on with the Union Pacific Railroad. You would see it later on with the interstate highway system and the various social changes attendant upon that. And you see it going into reverse now with the insistence on building safe and dependable light rail networks in our major cities. So it's an interesting digression into how governments use physical infrastructure to exert control.
Why don't we bring up a screenshot 18 that actually continues.
Before we do, it might be worth noting the whole point of the Crown Colony, and this is something that you see throughout this section of American history a lot. A lot of these coastal elites that largely form the conservative faction, with notable exceptions here or there, they are very Anglophilic once the United States gains independence. And you can already see this before the conflict starts. There's a recognition that the British system is the best system or form for them to maintain their power. The Crown Colony is extremely limited in terms of autonomy at this point in time, especially because this is before a lot of the 19th century reforms to how the British governed their colonial empire. The Crown Colony was very resistant to autonomous change. If the Quakers had succeeded, or rather, if any of the colonial elites succeed in getting a crown colony where there was originally a separate charter that had local autonomy, local legislation, and whatever else, that's provided the crown doesn't displace them, which could always happen. It's basically a guarantee that their power would be maintained with a strong force behind them.
Yes, and I'd actually quoted from something I'd screenshot as well, so I may as well read the rest of it. That's number 18. So continuing from the point about converting to a crown colony, though they had, quote, though they had none too great a love for the Penn family, they knew full well that the creation of a crown colony would place them entirely at the mercy of the oligarchy. In this struggle, John Dickinson led the Proprietary Party, which had the support of the West. Franklin, who oddly enough has since acquired a reputation as a Democrat, was the agent of the oligarchy in England. A future loyalist, Joseph Galloway, led his forces in the Pennsylvania Assembly. And then continuing on, screenshot 19, quote, British policy was at once the occasion and the excuse for action in Pennsylvania. As in the other colonies, the propertied classes were strongly opposed to any acts of Parliament infringing upon their local independence or interfering with the profits of trade. But the arguments they advanced in support of their rights were a double-edged weapon that cut in favor of the unrepresented classes as well as colonial self-government. By 1775, the oligarchy began to realize that it was caught between the hammer and the anvil. This became increasingly clear as revolutionary organization was developed, wherein the old restrictions on the franchise and county representation no longer held. The creation of a provincial congress gave the West a dominance in the colony and deprived the three old counties of the hold they had over the majority of the others. Yet the old assembly continued to meet and refuse concessions that would have weakened the radical program and enabled the assembly to assume the leadership itself. By thus refusing either to lead or to guide, The Conservative Party was thrown from power in June 1776. The Radical Party, temporarily unhampered, was able to write the most democratic constitution any American state has ever had. End quote. Ryan, would you like to say anything to that?
This is going to be the start of a long trend that we see, where the conservatives at the start of the conflict basically have everything that they would need to maintain their power if they played their cards correctly. But in a perennial conservative fashion, what they end up doing is taking this completely unstable, unmaintainable, like middle position that no one really likes, that is entirely foreign to any sort of prior order. It's very much like a middle ground, but it's against the radicals, so that's all that really matters. It turns out that's not enough to win. The radicals tend to out-organize them. They actually have expertise, and they want to accomplish things that, to the people that want to organize, makes sense, and then also historically makes some amount of sense, as opposed to these like weird harebrained conservative schemes. So throughout this whole thing, we have the pattern of the conservatives usually start in power in the places that really matter: New York, Pennsylvania, a good chunk of New England and the South. They lose power because they're ineffective, and they take completely weak positions. And then by the end of it, as we'll see probably next stream, I believe, they manage to worm their way back in. So it's a diatribe I'll probably be repeating a little bit during these two streams, but if the people in the audience do not understand the pattern and do not see the analogy today, it's not much that can be done to help them.
And the other running theme I suspect that's going to develop during the stream is also foreshadowed here with this talk of revolutionary organization. As we shall see, the conservatives begin the game with complete ownership of the board. They control all the colonial assemblies, they have all the institutional power, and in response, the radicals start spinning up private organizations, unofficial organizations, semi-governmental organizations in parallel to the governing structures of the colony that gradually grow and eat the governing structures of the colony. So this whole period of history is a study in two things. One, it's a study in elite theory. These organized radicals are able to, from not necessarily from the bottom, I suppose from the middle, organize themselves into an effective power-wielding bloc. And then the second thing is that you can, in fact, just do things. Nothing that we're going to see the radicals do came with any stamp of authority from any government. They organized themselves, and then they moved into power based on the organization that they achieved.
Yes, very good. And I've actually kind of selected basically the entire Pennsylvania section. So if we bring up screenshot 20, I'll continue reading from the bottom of this one and continuing to screenshot 20. And this is on the conservatives. So what did the conservatives do after what I had just read, where they were thrown from power? Quote, the conservatives, led by James Wilson, Robert Morris, John Dickinson, and others, opposed the new order so bitterly that they very nearly wrecked the government of the state and did not, in fact, render it largely ineffective in fighting the revolution. And did, in fact, render it largely ineffective in fighting in the revolution. The unicameral legislature, which they had considered satisfactory so long it had been in their own control, they now criticize as the worst possible form of government. Their proposal of a system of checks and balances as the remedy for all political ills was a thin disguise for their desire to regain control of the state. By 1779, they had made some political gains, but they were a minority. Their control of the democratic government was bound to be precarious. Recognizing this to be so, they turned more and more to nationalism in the hope of gaining power and protection in another political sphere. They became more and more insistent upon the creation of a national government. Their program involved strengthening the Articles of Confederation, but when this failed, they participated in a conservative political revolution which ignored the legal methods of constitutional change and created a government in harmony with conservative ideas and experiences. End quote. And of course, he's talking about the overthrow of the Articles for the Constitution that we have now there. So, I mean, basically, this ties right into the pattern we see too, where, what are the conservatives doing after they lose? They try and weasel their way back in through any back door they can find, and ultimately effectively just coup the existing order because they could not get their way and completely change the form of government out from under the opponents who had outwitted them. So, they changed their principles. Now they're criticizing the government they had before when they don't like it. They turned to nationalism, which they didn't believe in as before, in a way of centralizing power. What we're going to see here basically is the conservative faction in all of this, in all of the colonies, is all about centralizing power, which is a weapon they can wield against the individual colonies by the conservatives in all states uniting against the revolution, basically.
So there's something that's very important here, and I believe, Charlemagne, that you've spoken on this at length. So if you want to jump in, or if you don't, doesn't matter. But feel free to. It is noticeable that part of their justification for a lot of this is this suddenly concocted idea of checks and balances, not the separation of powers or anything like this. Or it's a legal ideology. This idea of checks and balances and the creation of a much more centralized government with just centralized parts under it that somehow check each other. Because if you read, especially a lot of very old documents, checks and balances don't really appear so explicitly, if at all, in some cases, especially in the English legal tradition. It's only now around this time that you find checks and balances being pushed by very specific groups of people. And usually the check and balance is if we give our group part of the government, and then we give another part of our group another part of the government, then you, dear radical, you middle-class peon, all of your worries will be put to rest. Nothing bad will happen, and we will get along happily as it was before. It's a very stylized and hostile reading on my part, I understand, but it jumps out to me, especially when I read this section.
Yeah. Checks and balances is often a lie to conceal where power lies. For example, I believe Thomas Paine wrote about this. I think we even read the passages the other week in terms of Parliament and the King, the idea that Parliament checks the King or the King checks Parliament. I mean, either one of these bodies is in power or not. They're not checking each other. One has power and the other doesn't. By the time of the Revolution, at least, the Parliament is the body with power and not the King. That's to say the king does not have power, but if you're looking for the source of sovereignty in Great Britain, it lies within Parliament at this time, and that's where most of the complaints are addressed to from the colonies to the Parliament. Let's look at screenshot 21. I go through a little bit on Maryland and Virginia here, so we'll tackle those both in once. So, quote, "The fears of the aristocracy proved groundless. The Maryland Constitution of 1776 was one of the most conservative of the period. The Senate became a refuge for wealth and an effective brake upon radicalism, for its members had to possess £1,000 worth of property, and they were chosen by an electoral college. This continuance of power of the wealthy aristocracy had an important effect on the Articles of Confederation, inasmuch as it enabled the great men who had been land speculators to exercise political influence in the bitter controversy over the disposition of the western lands. Virginia, like the other colonies, had come to be dominated by an aristocracy, in this case an aristocracy of wealthy planters in the Tidewater area who regarded themselves as Englishmen and were as jealous of their local rights as Englishmen everywhere are said to be. They ran the colony for their own particular benefit, they embezzled public funds, and they used their control of the legislature to further their speculative schemes in Virginia's vast western territory. They were members of the established church and looked askance upon and even persecuted dissenting sects," end quote. So these are just give us two examples of deeply entrenched and fairly corrupt aristocracies, even by the standards of the time, and that's just worth highlighting. We've discussed the Virginia Tidewater elite and the issues with them several times now on these streams. This has been a persistent problem for Americans as this period developed. Oh yeah, there's another thing to mention on checks and balances. We have this idea, this is some idea taught in like your 6th grade civics class or whatever, in how the current constitutional government works with, the The legislature checks the executive, which checks the judiciary, which checks the legislature, and same in the other direction. This is also just a lie. Either a power is sovereign or not. Either the president is a sovereign branch of government or he isn't. This idea that one branch sort of reaches into the other and checks its power is basically only used by people who have power to prevent themselves from losing it. It does not exist in any case to form better government or something. It's only to resist challenges to whatever established order there is, because that's what checks and balances is for. It's for preventing change. Who doesn't want change? The quote-unquote conservative class that's currently in power. What do they wish to conserve? Their own power.
I simply must hasten to point out that it's pronounced Xance.
You cut out or I did? What did you, what is pronounced what?
Sorry, technical difficulties. Never mind.
Okay. All right, good. I'm still good then. All right, let's go on. What do I have on page 34? That's the next thing I want to call out. This is on the intolerable acts. Ryan, did you want to add anything, by the way, before I continue?
And this is from my own experience reading through, and then also speaking about and teaching American history. The power of land speculation during this period, and its motivation of actions taken by what are otherwise romanticized and purely noble founding fathers it's hard to overstate. So a lot of this issue that you hear about now about land speculators influencing this or that legislature is extremely important. It was a very big issue. Could we create just out of thin air basically a national government that could just nationalize the land of certain states? And usually these nationalizations, the plans proposed for them would heartily benefit a lot of very specific, usually conservatives, and further enshrine their power and their bank accounts, which is another form of power. So this is something to keep in mind. This is not, and this is actually a fairly ecumenical point that is made in American historiography. The progressives talk about it, the libertarians talk about it, the Marxists talk about it, and then the only group that really does not talk about it are the nationalists and the conservatives, probably because it provides a more negative light on the people that aren't supposed to have a negative light shown upon them.
Yeah, it's definitely the case that the history presented here shines much more negative light on certain parts of the founding fathers that modern conservatives would not want you to recognize, because there are direct parallels, as we've now stated pretty directly. This screenshot I have up is from the section on New York. I'll read from the beginning of that section really quick. Quote, "In New York, the history of the outbreak of the American Revolution is in large measure the history of the conflict between a conservative party composed of wealthy landowners and merchants and a radical party composed of artisans, mechanics, small shopkeepers, and the unenfranchised generally in the city of New York." End quote. So that's the context here. New York, quite different from Pennsylvania, and I'll go ahead and read just in terms of how the elites responded, which we'll see in the passage I read right here. Before I read it, you can see it mentions the intolerable acts. What were those? They were 4 British laws, and they it's called the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, and the Quartering Act. These are colloquially known as the Intolerable Acts. So I'll go ahead and read, quote, "With the passage of the Intolerable Acts, the old issue of absolute versus modified importation was revived, and also the question whether the unfranchised should take part in the election of the extra-legal committees which were formed. The conservatives began to realize that they must join in the illegal movement if they were to direct the policy of the colony. The result was that the New York merchants were able to play a far more important role than those in most of the other northern towns. Recognizing the activity of the Sons of Liberty was backed by wide popular support, the conservatives determined to capture the organization. Through clever political strategy, they secured the election of a policy-forming committee dominated by themselves, in a meeting in which Governor Morris beheld his fellow citizens very accurately counting all their chickens, not only before any of them hatched, but before above one half of the eggs were laid. In short, they fairly contended about the future of our government, whether it should be founded upon aristocratic or democratic principles. But the committee was soon faced with a far more practical problem. At its first meeting on May 23, 1774, it considered a letter from Boston demanding that New York join with Boston in the absolute non-intercourse with England. The New York merchants were in a dilemma. They were firmly opposed to non-intercourse, but they knew that if they failed to support Boston, they would lose control of the radical movement. So high did popular feeling run. On the other hand, if they agreed to absolute non-intercourse, they would lose all they had gained in their long struggle with the radical party in New York. Their only hope lay in a delay. Therefore, they wrote to the Boston radicals that absolute non-intercourse was a general problem which only a Congress of all the colonies could settle. This might actually be the next screenshot here. I don't know if I have this one. The call for a Continental Congress was a way out for the New York conservatives, who hoped to defeat radicalism by putting up to a body which presumably the conservatives would control the question of how British measures should be thwarted. They had no idea that the radicals would dominate the First Continental Congress, adopt complete non-intercourse, and transform mere opposition into the beginnings of a movement for independence. End quote. So that was a lot there. Contextually, if you didn't put two and two together, we're talking about non-intercourse with the British in terms of trading. Massachusetts was one of the more radical colonies in terms of cutting off trade with the British fully before the others did, and very much Massachusetts jump-started the Revolution and sort of forced the hand of some of the other states by doing this in more or less setting up a you either join us or die type situation. I can't remember if we talked about this pre-stream or actually earlier in the stream, but basically, the New York conservatives believed that they would actually defeat the radical movement within New York by putting the issue before a Continental Congress rather than trying to decide upon it on their own. And they were in this situation where if they acted in their own self-interest as merchants, they would suffer serious financial harm if trade with Great Britain was cut off. But of course, if they did not support that, they would lose control of the radical movement. So what do? They pick this non-effectual third way, as the conservatives tend to do, in just sort of kicking the can down the road into this body that they presume they would control.
Does it work?
Well, hopefully our viewers know how this story turns out.
It works for the non-conservatives, that's for certain. I am positively delighted with the outcome, but I doubt the conservatives were. The other thing to note here, and it's an important important thing to tie back to the Thomas Paine stream that we did. The intolerable acts were explicitly justified on punitive grounds. And this was at the same time that the conservative or the royalist factions were arguing that the colonies here in America and the mainland in Britain were really one and the same country and people, which it's absurd. If you could imagine that Britain would single out like a specific province to punish them for something that they did against the state. No, and specifically this one group. Like one of the acts is literally titled the Boston Port Act, where they singled out the Boston port because of the symbolic event that happened against the British government. It's absolutely absurd. But yet the conservatives and especially the royalists at the time maintained both, that they could single out and punish basically their own country. I bring this up for a couple of reasons. Number one, a lot of the early American government was staffed with Anglophiles. How this was possible still after all of this that had happened is astonishing to me. It's a very, despite the fact they're universally renowned for being nationalistic, it's a very much seems like a national betrayal that they still opine for a country that tried to punish them while claiming they were one and the same group. So it's something to point out. The other thing to point out is that this is a line of reasoning that the federal government will use later in American history. The country is one and the same, but it has the power to single out and punish one specific part of the country that's not different. It's still the same country. It's completely united. There's no differences between them. Same people, same country, but the federal government or the national government has the power to single out that group, which is one and the same, and punish them. It's a recurring theme that's very pernicious and morally reprehensible, but that's a moral position, not a value-free historical judgment.
All right, I have this one last selection from the New York area, and actually I will read the precursor paragraph as well, just because it really gives you context into how the conservatives were thinking. So again, Governor Morris of the colony of New York. Quote, many men were wise after the first Continental Congress, but in the months preceding it, only a few foresaw the danger to the established order. One of these was Governor Morris, who saw, possibly before any other of the conservative class, that it was the British connection that kept the wealthy in control, and that they could not remain in power forever unless they could keep the mob in ignorance. This they could not do, he wrote, for, quote, the mob begins to think and reason. Poor reptiles. It is with them a vernal morning. They are struggling to cast off their winter's slough. They bask in the sunshine, and ere noon they will bite, end quote. The gentry feared this, he said, but he predicted that the committee appointed would deceive the people once more, and again forfeit a share of their confidence. If this kept up, quote, farewell aristocracy, I see with fear and trembling, that if the disputes with Great Britain continue, we shall be under the worst of all possible dominions. We shall be under the domination of a riotous mob. It is to the interest of all men, therefore, to seek for reunion with the parent state, end quote. And end quote. So I think that gives you a pretty good idea of what people like Governor Morris actually thought of the majority of the people he governed. I will continue with the quote on screen. Quote, thus Morris saw in 1774 what others were not to see until 1775 and even 1776, that the British connection was the guarantee of the existing order, and like many another, he preferred the existing order, even with irritating British legislation, to the possibility of an internal social revolution. As it turned out, the conservatives in New York were clever enough to keep control of the revolutionary organization and to prevent the overturn that occurred in Pennsylvania. They opposed independence as ardently as did the Pennsylvania conservatives, but they kept control of the revolutionary organization long enough to write a conservative constitution for the new state. Then they lost power to the small farmers united behind the leadership of George Clinton. When the revolution was over, they engaged, like the conservatives in other states, in undoing the Articles of Confederation, end quote. So that's really interesting. That ties into, well, again, it ties to the central thesis that the Articles of Confederation were the sort of true form of the United States of America, if you take that frontier form we described in that previous stream as sort of the true form of the American, and the conservatives or reactionaries undid that with the U.S. Constitution, which provided them the centralized control they needed to put their power back where it was when the British were in control. Basically, the idea was to entirely undo the revolution in terms of their power, with the only difference being that they were now in charge with the same level of authority they had garnered from the British government. Also interesting in this passage is this general idea of conservatives infiltrating, taking control of revolutionary movements in order to guide outcomes. This is certainly something we see the conservatives of our own time doing. Whether or not these are conservatives of left or right, this is absolutely a pattern that one must be wary of in terms of engaging with the existing order and how it may seek to infiltrate in order to ultimately retain its power, even when it gives the appearance of concession or being overthrown. In some sense, active participation in the overthrow allowed the conservatives to ultimately re-cement their own power at the end of what is called the critical period, and bring in the Constitution.
This pattern of infiltrating insurgent groups and guiding their direction, the conservatives are a group that does this, yes.
I have one more thing on page 52. And that'll end
before
the
we
state
move
section.
on.
Well, yeah, I want to let you guys add anything else you want to right now.
Yeah, before we move on, just to have like a sort of a Schmittian analysis while I'm on my Schmidt kick. Something that is worth pointing out is that the conservatives as a group are not inherently interested in like the nation's people or heritage or anything like that, because historically, at least, this is not an all times and everywhere sort of truth, but historically, especially in the Anglosphere, anytime push comes to shove, the conservatives always side with whichever side allows them to continue in power, at least nominally. And in fact, I think that's mostly true for a lot of continental European countries as well. A famous situation in Germany comes to mind. But this is something to keep in mind. The conservatives as a group are not by default friends. They are not on your group's side in any sort of existential struggle. They are very much on their own side. They're like rogue mercenaries, and they will go wherever it benefits them. So if I were to make an application to the modern day, since this book continually illustrates this happening, at least in the American context during this time period, it might be worth noting the conservatives are good when they do things that you want. So if they, in this case, if they set up committees that allow you to just seize power from them, that's very good. If they start echoing your talking points so that you're no longer entirely persecuted by the state, you have some sort of at least Overton cushion, that's good. But it's not going to always stay that way. They very much need to be prodded in that direction, as this book illustrates as well. And they are always liable to change. So it's something to keep in mind. It's a much more strategic point than what we usually deliberate on for this stream. But it will always bear repeating whenever the subject comes up, is that these groups that organize themselves as the conservative group and look out for the conservatives are very mercenary when it comes to any sort of political disputes or contest.
Very good. Let us bring up screenshot 52, and we will now enter into the Continental Congress period. This is the closing of this part of the book. Now, Jensen goes through many states. We're not going to go over all of them, but there is more background for the other states if you're interested in picking up the book yourself. So, quote, "The calling of the First Continental Congress wrought a fundamental change in the growing revolutionary movement. No longer were the scattered revolutionary forces feeding upon the vacillations of British policy and the exigencies of local politics the center of the movement. When Congress outlined general policies which achieved the status of law as a result of popular support, it took the lead in the revolution, although its ineffectiveness as a revolutionary organization was determined ultimately by the political character of the state organizations sending delegates to it. As the local radical parties gained power and sent radicals to Congress, it changed its policies. The history of those changing policies is the history of the outbreak of the American Revolution," end quote. And then, so I think 55 is next if you want to bring that up. And remember it's 54. Remember when the word radicals is used in the context of the book, Jensen sort of corrects himself post facto to interpret those as popular leaders. So, continuing on page 54, this is the beginning.
Actually, Charlie, before we continue, I'd just like to make a quick point here. So he's saying, that the Continental Congress's character and policies would change as the radicals gained organizational momentum in their respective states. And in one particular passage, Jensen talks about Sam Adams and his political machine in Massachusetts in particular as being very effective at this. Sam Adams was able to organize, a grassroots organization, which then sent radicals up to the Continental Congress to do the things that the radicals wanted. And it's very instructive in the current context that if you want to affect change, you don't start in Washington, you don't start with the Continental Congress, you start in your home state, you start in your hometown. Sam Adams's political machine wasn't even a Massachusetts political machine. It was strictly a Boston political machine. But because he organized and built up his own organization, he then had a platform from which to affect the destiny of a nation.
Absolutely, and that's in the previous section when Jensen discusses Massachusetts. There are a lot of good lessons in this book, and yeah, it's very much a bottom-up revolution in terms of how these quote-unquote radicals ultimately achieve their objectives. And so I definitely highly recommend picking up this book for yourself and reading it. Now, continuing, page 54, quote, ironically enough, the actual call for the First Continental Congress grew out of the dilemma with which the New York conservatives were faced when the Boston Committee of Correspondence proposed absolute non-intercourse until the repeal of the Port Bill. Just let me end quote real quick right there. I mentioned this earlier, but because you had just mentioned Boston and Sam Adams, I had mentioned how Massachusetts more or less forced the revolution by determining on non-intercourse with Great Britain. Obviously, this had ramifications for all the states, especially considering the status of Boston as a port and merchant center. And Samuel Adams and his crew of popular leaders that were sent to the Continental Congress were very much responsible for this. So that just emphasizes the point even more. Continuing, quote, if they accepted the proposal, they would identify themselves with the program of the New York radicals and thus lose all the gains they had made in a long struggle. If they rejected it and advocated their own policy of modified non-importation, they would lose whatever influence they had with the radicals. Only by seeming to do that which they had no intention of doing could they remain in control. Hence they suggested to the Boston radicals the very first thing the latter had long desired, a Congress of all the colonies. They justified this means of escape from their dilemma on the ground that the cause was general and affected the whole continent. A Congress of deputies should be called without delay to pass, quote, some unanimous resolutions formed in this fatal emergency, not only respecting your deplorable circumstances, but for the security of our common rights, end quote. In the light of these sentiments, wrote the committee, it would be, quote, premature to pronounce any judgment, end quote, on the question of non-intercourse. In taking this course, the New York leaders undoubtedly felt that the Congress would be controlled by the conservatives. Certainly, they would not have suggested it had they foreseen what was to happen, end quote. So that more or less treaded on some ground we'd already covered.
Seeming to do what you have no intention of doing. Can the audience, as an exercise, think of any more contemporary instances of the Republicans or the Democrats engaging in just that practice?
Gee, I wonder. So I think that mostly speaks for itself. Let's go to Screenshot 57. Quote, the personal biases and interests of the individual members must also be considered. The delegation from each colony was composed of both conservatives and radicals, some being dominated by the one and some by the other group. Moreover, the radicals did not always agree with one another, nor did the conservatives. There were votes that cannot be accounted for by self-interest, political philosophy, or state and sectional interests. Thomas Burke discovered in 1777 that the reason Georgia always voted with Connecticut was that the lone Georgia delegate had once been an inhabitant of the New England state. It is in the light of such exceptions, contradictions, and inconsistencies, and yet in the light of a really fundamental division of interest and political philosophy between conservatives and radicals, that the history of the Continental Congress must be considered. End quote. So the reason I particularly grabbed that one is because it makes the point that many decisions that happened at this time and happen at other times have no actual connection to any particular political commitment or anything of that, but just a personal chance association and background of happening to reside in one particular place and therefore having a preference for it, at least in terms of how the author phrases Burke's discovery. So I thought that was pretty interesting to point out, and certainly applicable. Yeah, go ahead.
One might get the impression that history is an interaction between vast impersonal forces and individual people.
Indeed, one might. Let's jump to screenshot 63. Quote, "The idea of non-intercourse was of course not new. What was new in the association was the plan for the uniform application of its provision through the colonies." End quote, really quick right there. So what is this association it's speaking of? Basically, the outcome of the first Continental Congress was the Continental Association. You might think of this as the precursor to the Articles of Confederation. It was sort of the first continental government, continental agreement would be the more accurate way to describe it, because it wasn't a government, but it was an agreement. And this association, the Continental Association, the main point of it was a decision on non-importation. And of course, this is what was determined. Non-importation was the agreement that the states arrived at, or at that time the colonies arrived at, through this association that the Congress voted on. Anyway, continuing the quote. Quote, "There was to be no importation after December 1st, 1774, and no exportation after September 10th, 1775. The associators agreed to have no commercial dealings with those who broke the agreement. Merchants who imported after December 1774 and before February 1775 might either reship or store their goods with local committees who would sell the goods and pay the owners. Profits, if any, were to go to those suffering from the port bill. Goods imported after February 1775 were to be shipped back. Counties, towns, and cities were to select committees to observe the conduct of all persons with regard to the association. Names of violators were to be published in the public gazettes. Thus, those who refused to conform were punished by, quote, social ostracism, commercial boycott, and confiscation of property," end quote.
Yeah,
Recommendations.
This is a magnificent example of the revolutionary organizing that we were talking about at the beginning. This is a completely organic organization that was spun up, these local committees setting themselves up in every town to watch the traders, to make sure everyone was keeping to the agreement. They didn't do this with the force of law. They didn't have the state backing them to this. This is just an example of people doing things, people taking responsibility and actually affecting political action.
Quite so. The Continental Congress was formed in large part due to the efforts of these popular leaders. I'll just continue the quote here. Quote, "Recommendations such as these gave a sanction of sorts to revolutionary organizations. It gave them a common purpose, and hence made for a unity of action that would otherwise have been impossible. As Professor Becker suggests, the association emphasized the question of allegiance. One had to choose between obedience to the measures proposed by Congress and allegiance to the British government. Refusal to accept the association as a practical measure of opposition was evidence of a lack of patriotism and implied support of British measures, which one approved of, whether one approved of them or not. To the conservatives, who cared as little for one as for the other, it was a question of choosing the lesser of two evils. The middle-of-the-road policy, home rule within the empire, became increasingly difficult as the Continental Congress was steered in the direction of independence, and the British government made plain its intention of continuing a policy of coercion." End quote. So basically what we've described there in reading that is effectively the first national government, if you will, of the United States. And this is the Continental Association, predating the Continental Congress. Interesting as well, noting how the conservatives were stuck between the revolutionary direction of the Congress and being forced to accept that or become loyalists effectively.
And it was because their monetary interest was threatened, and that was what forced them to actually do something. It's an interesting lesson.
Yes, and I was going to say that one could conclude that forcing conservatives to make these binary decisions perhaps could be a general strategy that is applicable in other times and places. Now, moving on to screenshot 69, unless anyone else wants to add anything. So let's see. Okay.
Before we do move on, there's another interesting pattern emerging that might contradict what at least other people in the online sphere have talked about. Because all of the radicals which are out organizing the established elites that, as Mr. Quinn pointed out, just completely controlled the board at the beginning, they aren't upper-level aristocrats, stateholders, or anything like that. They're very much a lower-level elite. And yet somehow they're out organizing the existing elite, winning, and then basically forming their own assembly to do things, and then haranguing or ranching the old elite into doing what they want. It's a very interesting elite analysis that Jensen provides. That is perhaps an interesting counter to certain other elite analyses.
Quite so. Now, I have this quotation selected because it summarizes one of the arguments that was being used at the time, that the authority of Parliament ought to be recognized. Let me just see where in the book, because I'm holding the book in front of me, where this starts. Okay. Quote, behind Galloway's third argument for the recognition of the authority of Parliament was the same attitude that later prompted the Conservatives to demand a government stronger than the Articles of Confederation. It was used to oppose independence. It was used in an attempt to strengthen the Articles after they had been ratified, and it was a powerful motive behind the Constitution of 1787. One of the dangers that alarmed the Conservatives most was that there would be no central control, and that 13 independent states, each with claims against the others, might engage in open hostilities. Galloway pointed out that the colonies were, quote, so many inferior societies, disunited and unconnected in polity, that while they deny the authority of Parliament, they are, in respect to each other, in a perfect state of nature, destitute of any supreme direction or decision whatever, even to the settlement of differences among themselves, end quote. The seeds of discord had been plentifully sown in the constitution of the colonies, he said, and more than once they had broken out in open hostilities. Quote, they are at this moment only suppressed by the authority of the parent state, and should that authority be weakened or annulled, many subjects of unsettled disputes, and which, in that case, can only be settled by an appeal to the sword, must involve us all in the horrors of civil war, end quote. This argument for a coercive power over the states, and later over the individual citizens of the states, has a vital bearing on both the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of 1787. One of the fundamental differences between the two documents is the absence of provision for that power in one and its inclusion in the other, end quote. So either of you want to comment on anything there? I mean, basically, I included this to really drive home the point that the Constitution's purpose for the ruling elite was to give them that centralizing control over all the states. And, this is just one of the arguments put forward that, there'd be conflict and civil war. I don't think it wouldn't be right, I think, to sort of play a gotcha here on Galloway using our knowledge of what happened in history. I think that's sort of counterfactual. It's not very helpful. But the main point to emphasize is that the Articles of Confederation did not give the existing ruling elites the centralized control that they desired, hence why they were overturned. And you have it quite plainly there. Let's see.
It is. It might be worth noting that I can't find on my own page, but somewhere in there was a discussion that without the central government, basically these smaller political subdivisions were left on their own devices to solve their own problems. It's a very interesting point, which in the modern day still holds true, the central government is the thing that really prevents a lot of us from solving our own problems, and problems would be solved if only there was no central power currently inhibiting us. It continually comes up again, especially in English and American history, that this is the issue. The central government prevents people from solving major problems, and they just sort of allow it to persist. Interestingly, and only because I think they are too unfairly maligned, the only group that I see that really echoes this point constantly, and I think it's a very important one, are the extremely right-wing libertarians, which I think this is a talking point that they get very much correct, this idea that if only there was not this very unnatural and imposed central force which took for itself such power, a lot of our problems wouldn't exist because we would just solve them. We would do things more, which is I think it might be worth bringing up on this stream at least. It should fit somewhere into what we're thinking about.
Yes, let me close Audacity, which I clicked on. Please go away. Now, I'll actually read a little bit more there, just to sort of outline some of the futility of conservative arguments. So what did Galloway propose? Quote, he therefore proposed a plan of union with Great Britain. As he himself said, it consisted only of the great outlines or principles, but it did furnish, if the colonials really wished to stay within the empire, a foundation upon which something lasting could be built. It provided for a colonial parliament, or grand council, composed of members elected by the colonial assemblies. The executive was to be a president-general appointed by the king and holding office at his pleasure. His assent was to be necessary to the acts of the council. The colonies were to retain control of all their local affairs, but the President General and Grand Council were to act as administrators and legislators in all affairs of mutual concern to the colonies in Great Britain, and in affairs involving more than one colony. The Grand Council was to be an inferior and more distinct branch of the British legislature, but acts of a general nature affecting both might originate in either body, the assent of the other being required to make them valid. End quote. Yeah, so you can probably see what sort of a ridiculous attempt at a power grab by the conservatives that is. That solution was completely non-workable by the time the Continental Congress had organized itself. But you continue to see these sort of desperate attempts to retain that connection to the British Parliament, from which these ruling elites derive their power. Now moving on to screenshot 77. Yes. Let's see. Just checking for the context here. I'll just go ahead and read it. Quote, the situation was much the same in Pennsylvania. It was predicted that the American merchants would be ruined and that half the debts to Britain would never be paid unless obnoxious British laws were repealed. It was felt, however, that if the merchants did not suspend trade at the direction of Congress, quote, the people of the country will compel them, end quote, and there would be, quote, no power capable to protect them, end quote. The conservatives insisted that the radicals, quote, aimed at a general revolution and were promoting every measure to overthrow our excellent constitution, end quote. This excellent constitution, which guaranteed the rule of an oligarchy, was the ark of the covenant around which many events were to move in the course of the next year, and to which the conservatives became progressively more attached as independence loomed larger on the horizon, end quote. So yeah, this is just discussing again the Continental Association that the First Continental Congress had put together, and the issues it was imposing upon the merchant class, and the conservatives' strong desire to accuse the radicals of seeking independence, and by doing so, the accusation of seeking independence is sort of like the accusation of today that conservatives might throw at people for, not supporting a constitution in whatever incidents that allegiance might be questioned that might, serve their purposes. Let's see. Yeah, so I have another quotation here about the actual implementation of the association. That's number 78. Quote, in spite of the opposition, the association was put into operation with remarkable speed and effectiveness. The total decline in imports in 1775 as compared with 1774 has been estimated at 97%. Yet, in spite of its effectiveness in the colonies, it failed the desired result in England. The English merchants dealing with America had been panic-stricken at first and had appealed to Parliament to grant a redress of American grievances, though hardly in a spirit of disinterested altruism. The British government insisted that it was no longer a question of mere economics, but a question of political supremacy, and refused to recede from its position. The merchants, anticipating ruin, were furious. Presently, however, better economic conditions in Europe opened new markets for British goods, and large shipments of wheat from the colonies brought in larger payments, especially since there was no corresponding exportation to the colonies. These considerations helped to swing the merchants to the support of Parliament, and by the autumn of 1775, their petitions in favor of America had ceased to be based on their own economic necessity. End quote. So here we see after the Articles came into effect and trade between America and Britain, sorry, not the Articles, the Association came into effect and trade entirely ceased between the Americas and Great Britain. The merchants actually ended up switching sides and supporting Parliament rather than the Americas because of opportunities that opened up to them. So perhaps we can draw some conclusions about the allegiances of the merchant class there. But of course, then we have the famous shot heard around the world, which upsets the entire situation. Let's see, screenshot 79. After this is during the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. Quote, since the British government determined to use troops to enforce its laws, the Conservatives were faced with the choice of meeting force with force, or of submitting abjectly to what they felt, equally with the Radicals, to be an infringement upon American rights and liberties. Thus, they sanctioned the creation of an army, convincing themselves that it was for the purpose of defense alone. At the same time, they pleaded with the British government that their intentions were peaceable, and that their only desire was for a connection with the parent state on constitutional principles. The subtlety of these real truths was too much for the British government, which seemed to feel that their tongues were forked to split the truth, that word and deed might take diverging ways. The colonial radical party, too, which wanted preparations for war to proceed as fast as possible, charged the Conservatives with hypocrisy and self-seeking. Thus, the British government and the Radical Party in the colonies pursued measures which combined to force the Conservatives to choose between loyalism and independence. There was no hope for a policy of constitutional union so long as the British government was bent on subjection and the Revolutionary Party on independence. End quote. So again, that just gives us a bit of the history on how the Conservatives' hands were forced by both the actions of the British state and the radicals within their own country. It was either respond to force, which as Americans they were rather compelled to do so. But even when hostilities had actually broken out, the Conservatives were still trying to wiggle their way out of independence by arguing that the Continental Army would only be used for defensive purposes, whatever the heck that means. And it's no surprise that the British government was not accepting, these sort of ridiculous interpretations.
No, they were unconvinced.
It's a very strange thing, because if they had gotten their way, it would be suicidal. They wouldn't be on the British side, but also they would have they had pissed off the radicals, and then they didn't get their way, and both sides still disliked them strongly. It's a very miserable existence.
If they had gotten their way, we would be Canada.
Pretty much. I mean, that's basically the goal is home rule. The U.S. would be Canada. Their proposed path was absolutely suicidal, but hey, maybe they have that in common with modern conservatives as well. Let us move on to, let's see, I have screenshot 81 here. Quote, But although they acquiesced in the use of force, the conservatives maintained that it was for defense alone, and they continued to insist that reconciliation be sought. The quarrel, they said, must be considered a family quarrel, and all thought of revenge, of conquest, and of independence must be banished from every American breast. Their anomalous policy of presenting petitions at the same time supporting warfare gave a, quote, whimsical cast to the proceedings of this Congress, end quote, wrote John Adams. Quote, a strange oscillation between love and hatred, between war and peace, preparations for war and negotiations for peace. He believed that, quote, powder and artillery are the most efficacious, sure-able conciliatory measures we can adopt, end quote. So a bit of humor there.
It's important to note here that John Adams was one of the leading lights of the conservative side.
Yes, John Adams did. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's hilarious because much like modern day conservatism, they still have one or two people that are self-aware enough to understand how much of a circus their group is. It's hilarious that John Adams, of all people, is talking about how disjointed the conservative part is.
Yes, he's certainly one of them who saw the light, saw the writing on the wall, and the absurdity of what the other conservatives were still pushing for. Let's see. Page 82 is next. Go ahead.
Before we move on, something else that's worth noting, and maybe this was just because when I was growing up, that was at the time where the main conservative talking point was that they were the mature, realistic, pragmatic, and non-ideologically possessed group. But it's worth pointing out that just like in the modern day, you can see their appeals are entirely fanciful and wishful thinking. It's not a war. People are being shot at. Sides are mobilizing. We're purchasing military equipment, raising armies, and whatnot else. But it's just a family quarrel. What is that supposed to mean in a time of war? It's not entirely clear to me. It's not entirely clear what a army just for defense in a war like a war of independence or secession is supposed to look like. Is it just supposed to sit around and wait for the British to attack it? It's not entirely clear.
You've never shot your sister at the table?
So it's entirely wishful thinking, but yet they always framed themselves during this time period as the pragmatic, reasonable, mature, and tempered group. And it's the same thing they do today. They're entirely divorced from reality, but basically all of their rhetoric is we're pragmatic, we're non-ideological, we're very open-eyed, we're very cold and factual, and it's a complete falsehood. It's rhetoric.
Yeah, that's why I picked this passage out, because the rhetoric of a family quarrel is so outrageously absurd. It's the conservatives seem always to be, it's the respectable thing to do to reconcile our differences and support the constitutional government that we currently possess. It's just ridiculous when states of war exist between people, as you could certainly argue is present today, and to try and argue for this. It's respectable to put aside our differences, ignore the fact that the British passed a law shutting down one of our ports just as a raging punitive measure. You just have to accept it. It's respectable to just let the British do that. It's mature. This is just a family quarrel. Britain will calm down eventually, and they'll stop slapping their children. I really do not like conservatives. I usually try to maintain a more unbiased tone than I have in other situations, but talking about the conservatives here has really brought out just the necessity to illustrate how idiotic they are. Well, yeah, they're the people making appeals to a constitution while they're being routinely abused, and the abusers show absolutely no sign of ceasing. Yeah, it's completely cowardly, frankly. But yeah, trying to not get too polemic. Moving on to, although that's kind of the point of this entire period, right? So I don't think it's a huge deal when we're talking about the revolution. The radicals wanted preparation for out-and-out warfare. Their strategy soon secured the passage of a resolution advising New York to prepare more vigorously for its defense, since it was quote, very uncertain whether the earnest endeavors of the Congress to accommodate the unhappy differences between Great Britain and the colonies by conciliatory measures will be successful, end quote. This move was countered the next day by the adoption of a series of resolutions designed to carry out the conservative program. It was stated that, inasmuch as the colonies were in a dangerous condition because of the British government's determination to execute by force of arms the oppressive and unconstitutional acts of the British Parliament, it was necessary to put them in a state of defense. Yet they still desired reconciliation, hence a petition was to be sent to the king, and measures were to be taken for entering into negotiation for a settlement of difficulties, end quote. The success, I missed the bottom bit, I'll continue. The success of this move was only in part due to conservative control of Congress. It was also a tribute to the personal prestige and influence of the leader of the Conservatives, John Dickinson, end quote. So, yeah, you had, Mr. Quinn, you had made a joke about sending a strongly worded letter to the king after we realized we had been cut off, which that is quite literally what the Conservatives proposed here, was to,
another moment of comedy gold lost to the internet.
Yeah, unfortunately that was much more humorous rather than having to explain the joke, but oh well, what are you going to do? Anyway, let's try and finish up here, getting on to page 86. Quote, this fear that the colonies would be forced into independence by British measures on the one hand and the designs of colonial radicals on the other led the Conservatives to inaugurate a new policy wherever they were in control of the old colonial assemblies or of the new revolutionary organizations. In November, the Pennsylvania Assembly adopted a set of instructions which John Dickinson, as a member of the Assembly, had addressed to himself and his colleagues as members of Congress. In these instructions, it was argued, as in the second petition to the king, that a resort to arms had been made necessary by the oppressive measures of Britain. Yet the Pennsylvania delegates were ordered to dissent from and utterly reject any propositions, should such be made, that the cause or lead to a separation from our mother country or a change of the form of government, end quote. Again, we just see the Conservatives trying to wiggle their way out of an ongoing rebellion, civil war, revolution, whatever you want to call it. Let's move on.
I would say that with this context, the sort of bad parts of things like the Declaration of Independence or common sense or the crisis or anything else that have phrases that ideological subversives use against us, all men are created equal or whatnot else. I can also understand why such a radical stance was taken if this was the alternative. Like if my two options for this period are we get like a very radical, say, declaration, which is very strict. It lists all the grievances, it appeals to natural law, and holds no punches against the British, and really makes it clear that anything like reconciliation can no longer be countenanced. If my only alternative is like the conservative idea of like, yeah, sure, you beat and abused us, you targeted us with like acts named after targeting us, you shot our people and whatnot else, expropriated our houses. But I mean, just you keep not responding to our strongly worded letters, and that's really the final straw. Like I do feel like I would much rather have the much harsher documents with some cringy quotes in them than the very weak-willed and milquetoast conservative documents, which could have been the foundation of the country had things gone differently. It's a terrifying thought.
Absolutely. We talked earlier about how the United States would have been Canada, which it absolutely would have been. And imagine if our founding documents were these, desperately weaseling letters sent to Parliament, basically begging them to come to terms so that we can, end this war that has already broken out because your punitive measures have provoked it. I mean, it's
the mind reels.
The conservative mind. All right, page 87. Quote, unfortunately for the conservatives, the British government continued to play into the hands of the radicals. The king's proclamation of rebellion in August was an instance. Later, when the news arrived that the king had charged in his speech to Parliament in October that, quote, the rebellious war now levied has become more general and is manifestly carried on for the purpose of establishing an independent empire, end quote, the end of the conservative control was near. In order to deny this charge, James Wilson moved that the Congress declare to its constituents its intentions with regard to the question of independence. The radicals were alarmed. Sam Adams said that Congress had already been explicit enough and that he was afraid that they might get on dangerous ground. But all the radicals were able to do was effect a postponement of the motion. In the meantime, they had brought forward the program of Confederation. Sam Adams had written to James Warren early in January, in answer to a request from the latter, that he would hear of the Confederation when some gentleman felt more bold. It is not dead, but sleepeth. So desirous of Confederation was Adams that he even considered the idea of uniting New England in a confederation if the other colonies would not join, an idea which seems to have met with the approval of the Virginians. Franklin's plan was dug from the piles of unfinished business, and on January 16th, an attempt was made to have a day set for its consideration. The Conservatives, led by Dickinson, defeated the motion, and continued to gather their forces in anticipation of the discussion of James Wilson's motion for an address to the colonies, end quote. So, yeah, we can now see towards the end of the crisis period here where people like Sam Adams are moving for Confederation now. The first moves are being made, but the Conservatives are still running the Continental Congress by a very slim margin at this point, and are still postponing the full-on independence movement. Let's see. Next, 89. I picked out 89 because of what we had read a few weeks ago. Quote, the movement for independence really began with the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776. No longer could there be any middle ground where one might urge reconciliation and at the same time sanction force. Common Sense was a remarkable statement of the radical philosophy of government and on the radical attitude toward Great Britain. It aroused popular opinion, for it crystallized, in language easily understood and appreciated, the emotions and beliefs of the ordinary inarticulate masses. It began with an attack on government in general, stripping it of all its glamour with a statement that, quote, government-like dress is the badge of lost innocence, end quote. Reverence for the monarchical authority was jolted by the assertion that, quote, the palaces of kings are built on the ruins of the bowers of paradise, end quote.
Unless we let the radicals run away with this particular stream, let us recall that we looked at Thomas Paine's proposed system for governing the continent, and it was of dubious workability.
Yeah, it's going to be a common theme, but a lot of the radical proposals, a lot of them that didn't actually make it to implementation are going to be subpar, which is, I really want to talk about that right now, but I'm looking at the time. I think next stream where we continue this book would be great to talk about Confederation and American expressions of government, especially because I've written on some of that. I had some ideas about Confederation and whatnot. I feel like these books will be a great way to talk about maybe what did the radicals get wrong about governing, what did they get right. It's a good tempering, perhaps, of the anti-conservative streak.
And we can all look forward to that on the next exciting episode of Articles of Confederation.
Yes, indeed. And with that in mind, I just have two more screenshots to wrap us up as we move into the Confederation period. So what is the next one? It is number 90. Quote, the cause of independence was also promoted by the American Prohibitory Bill of December 23, 1775, which provided that the trade and commerce of all the colonies should be totally cut off, and that the goods and ships of Americans on the high seas and in the harbors were to be forfeit to the officers and crews of the British Navy. It repealed the Port Bill and restraining acts as inadequate for the existing state of warfare. The British opposition and the colonial radicals were agreed that this was a practical declaration of independence by the British government, as formal as an act of abdication could be penned, and that it destroyed all hopes of accommodation. One speaker observed that the bill answered all the purposes of the most violent Americans, and that it might well have been entitled a bill for carrying more effectively into execution the resolves of Congress, end quote. So a bit of comedy there. And final quotation, and then we'll make any closing remarks we have. 91, quote, "The act removed the last real objection to the opening of colonial ports to the world, a measure which the conservatives had opposed as they had Confederation because it was a step in the direction of independence. Now the radicals moved ahead, and on April 6, 1776, the ports of the colonies were declared open to all the world except the dominions of Great Britain, and subject only to such regulations as might be made by the United Colonies or of the several legislatures thereof," end quote. So yeah, that last bit was just on the debate over whether or not the ports should be open to the rest of the world, sort of as a means of, continuing trade, obviously, with all of the other ports in the New World. And that was solved for the British side because the British made the determination to basically force that outcome. So that brings us to the closure of the first part of this book. We have gone over Jensen's revolutionary history, his history of the revolution, and next week we will really get into the meat of this book, which is on the actual writing and ratification of the Articles of Confederation. So you can look forward to that next week. We'll get to some super chats now, unless
it might be
you. Go ahead, yeah.
It might be worth considering to leave the super chats for our first part of this stream for next week when the viewership has returned, since we've got a tiny amount of viewers still listening. Hopefully we could give the super chats some of their due.
That is actually a good point. So we will do that. We will save the super chats from this stream for the opening of next stream to start us off, or perhaps the end of next stream. Either way, that makes a lot more sense to me, since we did get a lot of generous donations.
Yeah, I was about to say, we received a lot of money this stream, and so if any of the donors watch this back and are, maybe unhappy that we're saving their donations, it's not out of a lack of appreciation. Certainly, the donations for this stream were exceptional in their amount. We're deeply grateful for them. It's just, they deserve to get a better hearing than the remaining remnant that we have right now.
You mean the loyal, hardcore cadre who came back, the heroes of YouTube? What better audience could you have than these loyal listeners who have stuck through us through the vagaries of the internet storms?
He makes a great point. I have no counter argument. Charlemagne, you're gonna be the decider here.
Well, look, we'll address them next week. I will just read out the names and numbers, and so we'll get them in on both. So Paladin YYZ gave us $75. We greatly appreciate your generous donation, sir. Alexander Hale
gave in name of the Paladin in truth.
Alexander Hale, a routine donator, if I recall, gave us $49.99. Once again, very generous. Melon, $15.
Hale and well met, sir.
Skibum 220, $25 with a salute, and the Shadow Band, $50. So we have a very generous set of donations. Actually, that's more than $200. So that's
amazing.
Awesome. I'm glad.
Thank you, gentlemen.
I'm glad people like this one. But we'll get into their comments next stream when we have more viewers, and also just to thank them doubly. All right, so with that, I guess we'll splice together these two streams into one video upload. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Let's see, let's do a little bit of shilling. So yeah, next week we're doing we're continuing to the second half of this book. I think we're probably going to do Jensen's second book on the history of the Confederation after this. And we've also tossed around the idea of just continuing right into Charles Beard's economic history of the Constitution. I think that's a sound plan. And let's see, on my personal blog, charlemagne.substack.com, I am going to be publishing a review of the book No More Napoleon soon, and I'll probably be streaming with Bede of Britannia, formerly known as Hitman, on it at some point. I'm sure he'd be up for that. Either of you have anything to shill? Do you have any OGC stuff to shill? The
brothers of the old Glory Club, grandsons of liberty, you can just do things.
Very good. All right. Well, I think that's as good of ending as we can ask for. So we'll see you next week.